Alright, so I know I'm about 17 years late on this review, and this probably isn't the Batman video you were expecting right now, but damn it, Batman Begins is an awesome movie, and I always wanted to make a proper video explaining the reasons why. Shit, and after 7 months since my last one, I should probably put something out, otherwise I'll have to start calling myself Cinema Sloth. Anyway, as the title suggests, I think this movie is pretty damn great. It has solid character work, great performances, a memorable score, excellent production value, and to top it all off, it changed the general audience's perception of just what a superhero movie could be. Suffice it to say, Batman Begins has almost everything you can ever want in a film like this, and it set the bar for everything that followed. However, even though I'm going to be doing a lot of stroking in this video, Batman Begins is by no means perfect, and you can bet your ass that I'll be addressing all the things that bug me in excruciating detail. But before I dive in, let me provide some context.
Before a take, Joel would pick up his megaphone, his bullhorn, and go, "Remember everybody, it's a cartoon." So that kind of set the tone and the style of Joel's Batman.
So, after Batman became a joke to general audiences yet again, the folks over at Warner Brothers weren't too sure what to do next with this franchise. A script or two for a Batman and Robin sequel got thrown around, but for years none of those ideas ever seemed to be able to materialize. And thank God for that shit, boy.
Let's kick some ice. You serious?
Eventually, the powers that be decided that it was time to reboot this franchise altogether with a fresh interpretation. And this new take would come from none other than Christopher Nolan, who was a relatively unknown director at the time. In fact, I think Batman Begins sort of started the trend of picking lesser-known directors to take over gigantic franchises. And while that generally works out as well as hiring a plumber to conduct your open heart surgery, fortunately Nolan had a solid vision for the movie he wanted to make. You see, Nolan had this mind-blowing idea that was so crazy, apparently no one even thought to consider it before. What if you treated a Batman movie as if it were any other serious film?
What?
I know, it was truly a revelation of epic proportions, but it was really quite ingenious on his part. He started by taking key elements from the comics and simply found a way of presenting them more believably than previous iterations. You know, without stuff like this.
7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
In fact, Batman Begins is kind of a rare film, in that being realistic seemed to be the guiding philosophy behind the entire project. Nolan applied his now signature style of making nearly every aspect of his world as practical as possible. In other words, almost everything you see seems like it could really exist or function in real life. This philosophy was applied behind the camera as well, with an emphasis on real locations, practical effects, and so on. Although beyond merely taking the design elements and overall tone more seriously, Nolan and co-writer David Goyer also sought to put some effort into the characters this time, giving them layers of motivation, internal conflict, and flaws, kinda like real people. They even elevated the material further by casting great actors in almost every role. No, not these guys. I'm talking about Katie Holmes. All in all, they didn't set out to just make a superhero movie on this one. They set out to make a good movie. And with that being said, let me get into why I think Batman Begins really works.
What the hell are you? I'm Batman.
To start, this film does a great job of establishing the character of Batman, as well as the world he inhabits. And it does this by breaking everything to do with this premise down into very simple yet effective questions and answers. First and foremost, what would drive a man to dress up as a bat and fight crime? Of course, this is probably the most fundamental question the film attempts to answer, but in the simplest of terms, essentially what it boils down to is our main character's motivations and how the environment affected his decisions. In the beginning, we meet Bruce as a happy young kid, who after having a traumatic encounter with bats develops a fear of them. That fear causes him to become anxious while attending an opera with his parents, and so he asks to leave the theater. However, this sudden impulse results in his parents being killed by a random mugger when they step outside. And that key event is then what drives him for the rest of the film, as he not only seeks justice, but also feels intense guilt for not being able to control his fear. With a setup like this, a natural follow-up question might be to ask, why didn't Bruce Wayne just become a police officer or a lawyer or something? Well, in addition to all that personal guilt, the state of Gotham City in the film lends a lot of credibility to the idea that Bruce would take more drastic actions. The audience is both told and shown that Gotham City has fallen victim to deep-rooted organized crime, which has corrupted most, if not all, of its major institutions. Dirty cops, bent judges, stolen falafel, you get the idea.
I have kids to feed. Well, I don't like falafel.
The existence of this deep-rooted corruption then makes working within that system in any capacity seem kind of pointless. And therefore, resorting to vigilantism appears to be a more reasonable response for Bruce given the circumstances. Now, while this amount of information is pretty sufficient for a Batman movie, Batman Begins doesn't just stop there and jump straight into an action plot. Instead, it continues to expand on this foundation, and answers even more naturally arising questions about this character. Like, what happened from the time Bruce Wayne's parents were killed to when he put on that batsuit? And how did he become such a good fighter? Well, in the time leading up to Bruce becoming Batman, we see how his guilt of not being able to control his fear slowly turns into deep-seated anger as he gets older. This anger comes to a head when his parents' killer is released from prison early in exchange for sharing some info about mob boss Carmine Falcone. Bruce is pretty pissed that this deal is even happening, but ultimately sees it as an opportunity to kill the man who took his parents from him. However, before Bruce can exact his vengeance, the mob ties up their loose end first.
Joe! Hey, Joe! Falcone says hi.
And Bruce seems to get a strange satisfaction out of watching the guy die. You see, after years of dwelling on what happened to his parents, Bruce has started to conflate justice for their murder with his own desire for personal revenge. And so he suggests to his friend Rachel that perhaps he should be thanking the mob for what they did. But Rachel shuts that shit right down, telling Bruce that if he really cared about justice, he'd look beyond his own pain and see how the mob creates new criminals and new victims every day using fear to maintain their power. With Rachel dropping this truth bomb on Bruce, he decides to stand up to Falcone and tell him that he's not afraid of him. However, good old Carmine quickly shows just how much power fear gives him over Gotham, and in a few brutal sentences basically tells Bruce to get fucked.
You've never tasted desperate.
After getting absolutely dunked on by Falcone, Bruce decides to abandon his money and notoriety, and haphazardly travels the world to try to understand not only what it means to be truly desperate, but also how to turn fear against those who prey on the fearful. Along the way, he becomes a pretty decent brawler, and even goes as far as to commit petty crimes like theft to deepen his understanding of the criminal mind. However, after living this nomadic life for some time, Bruce is finally caught and thrown in prison, and it's there where he meets a man named Ducard, aka Ra's al Ghul, who offers him a different path. Bruce trains with Ra's for years, perfecting his fighting skills and reaching his physical and mental peak. Most importantly though, Bruce finally conquers his fear of bats, and upon returning to Gotham, decides to use the iconography of his conquered fear against the criminal underworld. With these kinds of questions answered, the general audience knows far more about Bruce Wayne and Batman than they probably ever have. But they still might have a practical question, like, where does he get all those wonderful toys? Well, in the film, Wayne Enterprises is shown to be a company that specializes in cutting-edge technology. For years, they seem to focus on large humanitarian projects like the monorail system, but since the death of Bruce's parents, the company has started getting more into military contracts and heavy arms manufacturing. So Bruce, having a lot of clout in the company due to his name, is able to take advantage of these resources and consult knowledgeable people like Lucius Fox, which in turn provides a credible explanation for a lot of Batman's crazy tech. For example, we're told that the Batsuit, utility belt, gadgets, and cape are all just scrapped inventions for advanced infantry that were considered too expensive to manufacture on a large scale. Similarly, the Batmobile is just an abandoned prototype for a combat bridging vehicle that was intended to jump across rivers and shit, which explains why it has that big-ass turbine on the back. The icing on the cake here, though, is that while the film is explaining where all of Batman's stuff comes from, we're also given context as to why a guy like Lucius Fox would let Bruce have any of this stuff anyway. You see, besides Lucius holding the view that all these inventions belong to Bruce's family, Lucius used to be on the board of directors when Bruce's father ran things, and he was demoted upon the arrival of new management. Overall, you get the sense that Lucius has a lot of respect for the Wayne family, and therefore he has a sort of inherent trust in Bruce. This is all quite wonderful, as it makes it even more plausible that Bruce Wayne can get his hands on such advanced technology.
So what do you think? Does it come in black?
So, by taking the time to build such a rock-solid foundation and answer basic questions like this, Batman Begins greatly deepens the audience's understanding of this character and his world in a believable way. In other words, if you don't know much about Batman, this film is a great place to start, because it makes it easier than ever to suspend your disbelief and accept the concept as something that could actually happen. Now that being said, all this character building and exposition wouldn't be nearly as effective without the film also fully humanizing Bruce Wayne, by giving him some meaningful relationships that are masterfully intertwined. Firstly, Bruce's connection to his parents here, specifically to his father, is made much more central to his character than in any previous film. You see, rather than just having Bruce deal with the loss of his parents, the kind of people they were sets a high bar for Bruce to live up to. Not only were his parents very philanthropic, but the Wayne family in general has a long history of selflessly helping others and doing the right thing. Bruce's feelings about his parents and their legacy then inform a lot of the other relationships in his life. For one, Bruce is given a friend and later potential romantic partner in Rachel. Now, unlike previous films, Rachel isn't just some lady who shows up in Gotham and wants to bone Bruce because he's hot and rich. Instead, she's a direct connection to happier times in his life, and she's even made to be an essential part of his character development, needing to remind him of the type of man his parents would have wanted him to be. For example, when Bruce reveals to Rachel that he intended to kill the man who murdered his parents, not only does she give him a couple of good slaps, but she follows it up by saying that his father would be ashamed of him. This one comment seems to knock Bruce on his ass, and is the driving motivation for him to throw away his gun and stand up to Falcone.
I came here to show you that not everyone in Gotham's afraid of you. Only those who know me, kid.
Another key relationship in Bruce's life is his connection to his butler Alfred, who also plays a more significant role than what we've seen before. We're shown that Alfred essentially raised Bruce after his parents were killed, and it's clear that over the years Bruce has grown to see Alfred as sort of a surrogate father. As far as I'm concerned, this dynamic is the heart of the film, with Alfred not only bringing out Bruce's lighter side, but more importantly providing Bruce with guidance in his moments of doubt. Giving Bruce Wayne real relationships like this just makes the man behind the mask feel like a real person, maybe for the first time ever on the silver screen. And it does wonders for getting us invested in what happens to him. Although, beyond providing the audience with much needed context for this character, and getting us to understand him as a person, Batman Begins also does a great job of weaving one of the core tenets of the Batman character throughout the entire narrative.
Where are you? Here.
If you haven't noticed already, the theme of fear runs pretty deep in Batman Begins. Not only does Bruce Wayne use fear as a weapon to achieve his goals, but the antagonists in the film are all essentially trying to do the same thing. Carmine Falcone uses fear for simple power and control. He does this through good old-fashioned strong-arming, murder, and greasing palms. It's the most basic form of using fear, really. Do what I say,
or I'm gonna stab you through the heart with a fucking pencil. Do you understand me?
Similarly, Dr. Crane, aka Scarecrow, uses a fear-inducing toxin on people as a means of personal pleasure. In other words, Johnny likes to throw his gas in your face, and gets off as you hallucinate the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And last but not least, Ra's al Ghul seeks to use fear as a destructive agent, by trying to unleash Scarecrow's toxin on Gotham City. It's not often that you see a theme this essential to a character utilized so effectively across an entire film like this. When you combine that with all the other great setup and character development, it's clear that Batman Begins really does get a lot of things right. However, the time has come to start diving into the shit that doesn't work so well in this movie.
If you've got an issue, here's a tissue.
As far as I'm concerned, Batman Begins has 4 main problems. 2 minor ones pertaining to the production, and 2 major ones pertaining to the writing. To start with the minor stuff, yes, Christian Bale's Batman voice is ridiculous, and it's stuck to the reputation of this character like fucking tar.
Where were the other drugs going?
What I mean is that every asshole from here to Timbuktu now correlates a grovelly throat cancer voice with Batman, and it drives me absolutely insane.
Do you see what it sounds like?
Now, I can understand if Christian Bale really wanted to get into the role or be different from the other actors, but this over-the-top voice just clashes so hard with the otherwise serious tone that's being established here. If I was in charge, I would have told him to cut that shit out day one. But then again, Christian can be a pretty scary guy, so who knows what really went down.
I'm gonna fucking kick your fucking ass!
The other minor issue in the film is how the fight scenes are executed. I don't know why, but for some reason almost every fight scene is edited to ensure that the viewer has no fucking idea what's going on. I'm not sure if this was a stylistic choice on account of Christopher Nolan, or if he really didn't understand how to direct a fight scene when he made this movie, but a good amount of this stuff just makes me want to vomit. Oh well though, I'll take a good story with some bad action over the opposite any day of the week. But enough of this piddly production crap. Let's get into the writing problems.
Your compassion is a weakness your enemies will not share.
That's why it's so important. It separates us from them.
Alright, so in keeping with the idea of telling you everything you need to know about Batman, this film also attempts to explore the more philosophical aspects of the character, namely Batman's morality and the limits he places upon himself. You see, it's one thing for someone to be personally motivated, or to have environmental factors contribute to some self-righteous action they take, but how far is too far? And what exactly is true justice? Like a lot of Batman stories, Batman Begins answers this moral dilemma through Bruce Wayne refusing to take the lives of his enemies under any circumstance. It's an argument of sheer moral principle, really. If deviating from the path of the law is necessary for the greater good, then that alternate path needs to have limits of its own in order to avoid corruption. This character trait informs a lot of the conflict between Bruce and Ra's al Ghul, and it carries through all the way to the end of the movie. However, for as much as I can praise Batman Begins for even attempting to build ideas like this into the story, I think it makes a major mistake by making Bruce's no-killing rule a little bit too ambiguous here. For example, upon reaching the final stages of his training with the League of Shadows, Bruce is given a final test to prove his commitment to justice, and that is to kill a criminal. However, Bruce refuses to kill the man in front of him because he believes that compassion is the only thing that separates him from his enemies. Naturally, Ra's and the League don't accept this answer, and in a swift move, Bruce winds up creating a massive explosion in order to escape. Now, the first question I have is, how does Bruce take issue with killing this one guy, but then seems to have no issue starting a fire that blows up the entire building with God knows how many of the League's members inside? I mean, I get it. They didn't seem like they would just let him walk away. And they did say they want to destroy Gotham, more on that in a bit. But how are they any different from many other criminals that he refuses to kill in other circumstances? Let's not forget that Bruce does this mere seconds after we establish his super important moral principle.
I will go back to Gotham and I will fight men like this, but I will not become an executioner.
A few moments later.
Yikes. And shit, I mean, what even happened to that guy? He looked tied up, and a little bit hefty, so he probably didn't get away. I don't know. Maybe Bruce only intended to create a distraction here, and burning down the temple was just a happy accident. But what bothers me is the fact that I'm just not sure what the boundaries of Bruce's moral system really are. The best way I can describe it is that it's not so much a no-killing rule, but rather a no premeditated murder rule. In the film, Bruce doesn't seem to mind much if people die as a result of some external factor, even if he's the one that fucking caused it. And to make things even more confusing, at the climax, Bruce's morality doesn't even compel him to save his enemies from certain death. When Bruce leaves Ra's al Ghul to die on the train, he just says,
I won't kill you. But I don't have to save you.
This statement always bothered me, because it makes that line that Bruce won't cross needlessly blurry. You see, in most other interpretations that use the no-killing logic, Bruce would totally save Ra's from a situation like this, because by not saving him when he's clearly able to, he might as well just be pulling the trigger of a gun. Shit, and I guess I'm not the only one who thinks so. Even the crappy movie tie-in game knows that this is bullshit.
If not murder, what do you call this?
Anyway, even though I love that the film makes this morality question part of the narrative, the ambiguity of it all is just a huge sore spot in the script for me. What makes matters worse, though, is that the external conflict with Ra's winds up not even really being tied to this morality stuff all that much anyway. Instead, the whole conflict sort of devolves into a standard mustache-twirling destroy the city plot. Which brings us to perhaps my biggest issue with Batman Begins, the villain plot.
Time to spread the word. And the word is panic.
Now, while the bulk of this movie is very thoughtful in how it builds up Batman and raises interesting questions about morality, a lot of that thoughtfulness goes out the window when it comes to the villain plot and how it unfolds. You see, after Bruce returns to Gotham and establishes himself as Batman, the only thing left to do is tie together all the various plot threads and themes and give our main character a good external conflict to resolve. This is more or less what happens, but there are just a lot of things about this plot and how it's executed that don't add up. To start, the League of Shadows doesn't reveal their intentions to Bruce until his final initiation. When Bruce refuses to kill the criminal, he's told that he needs to be able to do that because the League is getting ready to destroy Gotham and they want him to lead the charge. Of course, Bruce objects to ham-fistedly destroying an entire city, good people and all, just to cleanse the corruption. I mean, I think any sane person would. I guess I just find it both really convenient and frankly unbelievable that A, the League's broader goal was never brought up in what looked like the several years that Bruce was training with them, and B, that Ra's would fully train someone who he wasn't even sure was 100% on board with the mission. It's kinda like training someone to be the world's greatest computer hacker in the name of saving the world. Then on their graduation day, after teaching them everything you know, you drop the bombshell that they're actually gonna help crash a bunch of airplanes or something. I don't know. It just seems like a surefire way to get a lot of people to turn against you. And worse, now they're just as dangerous as you are, so they're that much more difficult to get rid of if they resist. You know, kinda like this.
Familiar, don't you have anything new? How about this?
Beyond that initial weirdness, though, the way that the League goes about their plans seems really silly and overcomplicated to me. Basically, the League gets their hands on some machine that's designed to evaporate the enemy's water supply in desert warfare. They had Scarecrow dumping his fear toxin into Gotham's water supply for weeks, and so their big plan is to use the machine to disperse Scarecrow's toxin into the air, driving Gotham citizens insane. Now, while this is pretty cool from a thematic standpoint, I guess, with fear engulfing the city and all that, it's admittedly pretty fucking silly. Right off the bat, how has this toxin not created a ton of chaos in the time leading up to the attack? You'd think with the millions of people taking showers or boiling water, there would have been mass reports of people losing their damn minds. I mean, come on, someone must have been seeing a monster in their casserole. Who knows, maybe this was happening a lot, but the people in the League's pocket were just covering it up. After all, Ra's did say that they've infiltrated every level of Gotham's infrastructure. Although, if that's true, then why is there also a weird ticking clock element to this plan? You see, we're told that if Ra's gets the machine to the water mains under Wayne Tower, it'll cause a chain reaction and cover the entire city in the gas. But for how powerful and far-reaching Ra's and the League seem to be, why is their plan to start the machine in some crappy part of town, put it on a train, and then ride it all the way to the spot that they actually need it? I don't know. This all just seems like an artificial way of drawing out the climax to me. As if all that wasn't confusing enough, it's also revealed that all this cover the city and fear gas nonsense is actually the League's second attempt at destroying Gotham, with the first being an economic attack.
You attacked Gotham before. Of course. Over the ages, our weapons have grown more sophisticated. With Gotham, we tried a new one, economics.
This means that the League was responsible for creating the environment that made common people desperate enough to turn to crime, which in turn kinda led to the death of Bruce's parents.
Sure, I was desperate, like a lot of people back then, but that don't change what I did.
Now, this is just way too coincidental for me. What are the odds that the key event that motivates Bruce Wayne would be tied directly to the antagonist who he meets by chance in a random prison? I'm no expert, but I'm gonna say that that's extremely fucking unlikely. Unless we're meant to assume that Ra's coming to Bruce here was part of his plan all along. But even that doesn't work, because there's no way the League could have known the kind of guy Bruce would turn out to be or the things he'd want in his life. Let's just say it would have been pretty awkward if Ra's came to recruit Bruce and he was just some weirdo. Either way, I think shoehorning the League into Bruce Wayne's origin like this just stretches things a little too far. It makes this world feel smaller than it needs to. It would be so much better, in my opinion, if Gotham was just a crappy place. and the League's plan to destroy it didn't come about until after they heard Bruce's story about the rampant crime and corruption. Although even if that were the case, it still wouldn't fix what I think is probably the biggest issue of all here. And that is that the League's actions, both in the past and the present, are completely antithetical to their apparent goals. What I mean is that if the League's end goal is to defeat evil, I don't understand how acts like causing Gotham to have an economic downturn or covering the city in fear gas are meant to do that in any way whatsoever. Regarding their first attempt, what does making a city hungry, poor, and desperate really accomplish? I'll give you a second to ponder that, but the answer is it creates more fucking crime. When it comes to their latest attempt with the gas, making everyone lose their shit seems like it would just create an even bigger mess than there already is in Gotham. So, if anything, the League seems to only make criminals more powerful, and brings out the worst in everyone on purpose.
Create enough hunger and everyone becomes a criminal.
Of course, with a bit more tweaking, the idea of the League creating messes as an excuse to destroy shit later could have been interesting, but with their stated goals in mind, I'm afraid the actions they take just make them seem completely insane. At the end of the day, when you take all these issues into consideration, it becomes clear that there were definitely some missed opportunities here. Instead of the plot centering around the League wanting to destroy Gotham City, and Bruce simply wanting to stop them, perhaps everything could have been more focused on that initial moral argument that Bruce and Ra's had about taking the lives of criminals. Like I said earlier, I think any normal person would want to stop a city from being destroyed, but deciding on what to do about evil people is a much more nuanced and controversial topic. Maybe Ra's could have wanted Bruce to return to Gotham to specifically target the criminal underworld, and, not kill everybody else. If Bruce's moral system was better defined, maybe we could have seen a real philosophical debate play out between these two that would have highlighted the pros and cons of each approach. Come to think of it, that sounds kind of familiar. However, because these aspects of the film do get oversimplified early on, a decent amount of damage is dealt to an otherwise great story, and that's a real shame. Fortunately though, I think the strengths of Batman Begins still manage to shine through regardless. And aside from these issues, there's really not a lot else to complain about here. So, I guess it's about time to wrap this up.
As my plastic surgeon always said, if you gotta go, go with a smile.
Although I ragged on some script issues quite a bit here, I still think that almost every aspect of the filmmaking in Batman Begins is firing on all cylinders. A precise and fresh vision, compelling performances, a powerful score, top-tier production value, and a story that, despite some significant technical flaws, is still pretty damn good compared to most others in the superhero genre. With all that being said, it's no wonder why Batman Begins ended up being a huge success, spawning 2 gigantic sequels and cementing this interpretation of the character well into the public consciousness. In sum, Batman Begins changed the way that movies based on comic books are made, and got the audience to see Batman not just as a shadowy action hero or a fucking toy, but as a real character who we could relate to. While it's unfortunate that this film has sort of been overshadowed by The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, I still think it holds up pretty well, and I'd recommend it to anyone who wants to sit back and watch a good movie. Until next time.
That's all, bitches.